The 1920s was a decade full of changes. More people lived in cities, less people lived in farms. The nation's wealth had doubled, causing reckless spending. This was a time when America became a united country, from sea to shining sea. Everyone bought the same things, listened to the same music, danced the same, used the same slangs. For a small part of America, the 1920s was in fact roaring. But for many more people, it was full of strife.
During the 1920s, people expressed themselves through art. This brought around the idea of modernism, which was the new movement that went against all of the old values and became abstract and aesthetic along with futuristic and innovative. Many artists expressed realism, which was sought to release creative potential of the unconscious mind, such as dreams and imagination. Georgia O'Keeffe was known as the mother of modernism. Pablo Picasso was a painter throughout this time period. Grant Wood painted rural American Midwest. Thomas Hart Benton was a painter and a muralist who was at the forefront, along with Wood, of the regionalist art movement. And Edward Hopper was an American realist painter and printmaker. Architecture, much like modern art, expressed modernism. Buildings were designed in an Art Deco kind of way where it represented modernism while showing fashion. The buildings were one big model. Frank Lloyd Wright's style was the Prairie School, which expressed organic architecture. Louis Sullivan was known as the father of skyscrapers and the father of modernism, creating and making skyscrapers huge, no pun intended. Rudolf Schindler built around the area of Los Angeles and was influenced by his home country of Austria, the Austrian avant-garde, and defined modern architect in California. Richard Neutra was also an Austrian native architect who also built in California, except Neutra built in Southern California and was considered one of the most important modernist architects of the 20s. Literature has and will always be around, especially during times of trouble. The Lost Generation were a group of authors post-World War I that wrote about America and its everyday life. Ernest Hemingway was considered a timeless writer. He was simple and spare, a man of few words, who thrived on high adventures and road adventures. F. Scott Fitzgerald portrayed the ideal America, what America could be and not what it actually was. John Steinbeck wrote about the opposite of Fitzgerald. He portrayed the harsh reality of America. No matter how ugly and uncomfortable it was, he didn't censor a thing. Advertising and consumerism became a key point in the selling market. Brands we know and use today were created during the 20s, such as KitchenAid, Maytag, Bissell, and many more. Department stores' popularity increased, making Macy's the biggest department store known. In the mail, many people would receive mail order catalogs in which you could buy and receive items through the mail, essentially old-fashioned Amazon. Magazines and radios featured the first ever advertisements known as commercials. The American home was described as many different styles: Dutch colonial, Gothic, Italian, modern, English, and so on. Within America, consumerism and credit became known. Consumerism is the theory that it's economically attractive to attain goods and services in ever-increasing amounts. Credit is buying something without having the actual money and paying for it later. Within the American home, appliances came into play, such as electric refrigerators, electric irons, electric blenders, and spin dryers, and so many more that we have in today's modern home. Home radios were innovated to transmit from a long range, and people listened to them for sports, entertainment, news, music, and more. The economics of the 20s was made with new opportunities. The American standard of living was abandoning the farming life and moving to the suburbs. Wall Street became the place to get rich quick with stocks. Wall Street is located in Manhattan and was the headquarters of the largest U.S. brokerages and investment banks. Stocks were a risky financial transaction which allowed people to make a profit from a short-term fluctuation in the market value. Margin buying or borrowing money became a popular thing during this time, which ultimately led to the crash of '29, where all the stocks were failing, banks were failing, and people were borrowing too much money. Americans had more free time during the 20s, which they used to find themselves and their interests. This was called America's pastime. Baseball became a favorite in America. The New York Yankees, nicknamed Murderers Row, was considered one of the best teams to ever play, featuring the famous Babe Ruth on the team. Nut Rockne was a football coach for the college team Notre Dame, who were very outstanding in his kind. He was considered the most successful coach of all time. Jack Dempsey was a heavyweight boxing champion nicknamed Vanessa Mauler. Bobby Jones was a famous golfer who never took a golf lesson but managed to have the perfect swing by basing his swing off of Stewart. During this time period, movies were just becoming popular. They had been producing movies for a few years now, but they didn't start to get popular until the 20s. Movies were a cheap form of entertainment for Americans with free time. Hollywood became the film's world capital and created all of the movies shown in the U.S. Charlie Chaplin was a director and an actor. He created Chaplin Studios and created classic silent films. Greta Garbo was a Swedish-born American film actress. Clara Bow portrayed a flapper in the movies, and Josephine Baker was a superstar. She danced and sang and devoted her life to fighting racism. Prohibition was a national ban of the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol. The Volstead Act was an idea that law officials would provide enforcement for prohibition. They believed it would help the public's morals and health. Many Americans who consumed alcohol were outraged and made American life more violent and unsafe. Speakeasies were illegal liquor stores that popped up in secret around the country. Al Capone was an American gangster that profited off of the Prohibition era. He made money off of bootlegging, prostitution, and gambling. Trains' golden era had ended. During this era, trains became more evolved and made traveling from one side of the country to the other side easier. Metros and subways were created to save room and allow people to travel in cities quickly. The Railway Labor Act of 1926 was passed, providing better working conditions for railway workers. But the act did not make working better. It was getting better than it was before, but many railway workers had to wait until the New Deal before they were treated fairly. During the 1920s, Americans had become obsessed with flying. This became known as the Golden Age of aviation. Planes changed from being made out of wood and fabric to metal. Brainstormers were stunt pilots who performed tricks in the air. This was created to show off and brag how sturdy and reliable American planes were. Charles Lindbergh was the first American pilot to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927. Amelia Earhart is one of the most famous female pilots of all time. She reached record-setting speeds and distances, creating history. Henry Ford created the famous Model T, in which Americans during this time were driving. At the start of the era, cars were merely for the rich, but after Ford made the Model T so that any middle-class American could buy one. The top three companies who were creating cars were known as the Big Three: Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. The automobile created many jobs and influenced the economy. There were many jobs created at the factory of the cars were produced at, and at the gas pumps. During the era of finding yourself, women were becoming more independent and more free. Some women split apart from the standardized American woman and became what is known as a flapper. They cut their hair, wore revealing dresses, and drank liquor from flasks. Many women went from quiet and sheltered to loud and outspoken. They began to express themselves. Sigmund Freud was a neurologist who founded psychoanalysis, which treats psychopathologically with dialogue between patient and psychologist. Margaret Sanger was an activist trying to legalize birth control. After being oppressed for many years, African Americans found refuge within Harlem, where they could express their own feelings and emotions through jazz, poetry, and dance. Langston Hughes wrote unforgettable poetry portraying the colorful version of Black life in America. County Cohen, Claude McKay, Gwendolyn B. Bennett, and many others were also poets during the time period. Elle Hurston was a novelist and folk writer. She wrote about racial struggles in the American South. Many of the same people who wrote poetry also wrote full-length novels dealing with race. Dizzy Gillespie was a jazz trumpet player, band leader, composer, and singer during the Harlem Renaissance. There were dance moves created. Their dance moves reflected social and cultural experiences.